But the big story right now with Facebook is Australia. You see, the Australian government has for years been advancing a plan to shake down Facebook and Google on behalf of dying media operations. What they want is, you go to Google News, news.google.com. It's an aggregator. It takes news from all over the place and kind of customizes it for you, depending on your country. Here's the news for the United States. Here's domestic news. Here's international news, tech news, science news. I use it for show prep. Well, Australia has advanced a piece of legislation that says that if a website like Google or Facebook that are quote unquote aggregators, if they show you news from a news source, then they're going to have to pay the news source for the ability to display the news, which is kind of crap, is it not? I mean, how many people are going to jump through to your news site without you showing it on Google? I mean, if anything, Google and Facebook's ability to display news, so long as the click-through goes to those news sites so they can generate ad revenue, is actually a net positive for these sites. But in Australia, and largely it's been a Rupert Murdoch-backed initiative as a money-making venture, has advanced legislation in Australia to allow, or require rather, I should say, require these websites, Google and Facebook in particular, to pay for the privilege of displaying news sites. You go to Google News and you see a selection of news. In fact, allow me to do this. I'm going to go to Google News. The very top story that is displayed for me right now in news.google.com, of course, now that I'm doing this, the site's not going to load. The very first link I've got in news.google.com is to a Reuters story on the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines appear to be effective, such that Pfizer is saying maybe we only need to do one dose, which will be able to spread it out more, which is great if they do that. And this is a story I actually want to put in show prep later, but that's the top story for me on Google News. Now, according to this Australian law, when I click through this story and go to Reuters, that's actually somehow benefiting Google. And so for the privilege of Google displaying that story that I otherwise would have never seen from Reuters, Google has to pay Reuters. Google has to pay Reuters even though they're driving traffic to Reuters that benefits Reuters and all the other news outlets as well. Well, Google has super deep pockets, and Google said, hey, we'll do this. Essentially, Microsoft has been pushing this as well. Microsoft wanted to hurt Google and Facebook, and Google went along with it because they want to hurt Facebook too. So what Facebook decided to do was say, not going to play. So Facebook now is blocking people from sharing news articles. Here's a News Corp press release. News Corp announced today that it has agreed to a historic multi-year partnership with Google to provide trusted journalism from its news sites around the world in exchange for significant payments by Google. Facebook decided to stop. Here's the Facebook newsroom press release. In response to Australia's proposed new media bargaining law, Facebook will restrict publishers and people in Australia from sharing or viewing Australian and international news content. The proposed law fundamentally misunderstands the relationship between our platform and publishers who use it to share news content. It has left us facing a stark choice: attempt to comply with a law that ignores the realities of this relationship, or stop allowing news content on our services in Australia. With a heavy heart, we chose the latter. This discussion is focused on U.S. technology companies and how they benefit from news content on their services. We understand many will ask why the platforms may respond differently. The answer is because our platforms have fundamentally different relationships with news. Google search is inextricably intertwined with news, and publishers do not voluntarily provide their content. On the other hand, publishers willingly choose to post news on Facebook, and it allows them to sell more subscriptions, grow their audience, and increase advertising revenue. Yep. So Google goes around, and this is a big difference here. Google goes around and it scrapes the web. Now, what does that mean? So Google has, they call them spiders. Very insect terminology here. So Google goes around, this is how it builds its web of data. And Google has automated processes that goes through and pulls all Reuters information and pulls CNN's information and pulls the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's information and pulls my information and pulls everybody else's information and scans the websites, uses algorithms to compile what is the story about. And then when you go into Google and you put in information, it displays you based on this network of pulling information. Well, Facebook doesn't do that. Google actively goes out, pulls the content into Google. With Facebook, you yourself have to go to Facebook and drop in a URL. Or the news outlets, this is what really happens to the news outlets. The ABC News has a Facebook page, and they go, Facebook doesn't go out and grab the ABC News stuff. ABC actively goes into Facebook and puts it there. And essentially, there's what this Australian law says, and the reason I'm talking about it, we'll get to in a second. The Australian law says is, hey, if you go to Facebook and you drop this link, then Facebook's got to pay you for you having put your stuff on Facebook. And so Facebook's saying, screw you, we're not paying these people. They're benefiting from us. They drop a link on Facebook, millions of people see it and go to their website, and they put up an ad and they make money. Facebook is right. Now, the reason I talk about this is because this is coming to this country. It's where it's headed. The news media hates Facebook, and the reason they hate Facebook is because Facebook told them they would help them drive traffic. And the news media, incompetent at the web, outsourced pretty much everything to Facebook. And Facebook realized, you know what, it's really not in our interest to help these people. Why do we want to incentivize people jumping off of Facebook and going back to their site? So they stopped doing it. Well, that hurt the news media. So you need to understand that so much of the news media coverage of what's happening with Facebook is driven not by the purity of the issue, but because they hate Facebook. They blame Facebook for electing Donald Trump, and they blame Facebook for not helping them. They don't know how to build their business, and they're mad that Facebook won't help them. So what they've decided to do is essentially use governments as mob-like figures to shake down tech companies for money. Facebook is right. There is a big difference between Google, which actively goes out itself and pulls in the data, and then you can go to Google and you can see the headlines on Google. Facebook does not actively go out to CNN and pull CNN stuff and put it on Facebook. CNN or you have to go put it on Facebook, and then when you click the link, it goes to CNN. What's happening right now is the left in this country really hates that conservatives can bypass the media. The media hates that conservatives can bypass them and go to these tech sites, and that you and I can curate the news we think is relevant. So if you think there's a news story and you want people to see it, you can go to Facebook, put up a link, and you can write about it. Here's why I think this story is relevant. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Click the link, send them off to the story. The news media despises that you can do this because they want to control the news. They don't like that Facebook has democratized covering news. It's like why they hated Rush Limbaugh, frankly, because Rush Limbaugh bypassed the entire news. Rush Limbaugh's audience was larger than ABC, CBS, and NBC's newscasts, their nightly news. Rush Limbaugh had a larger audience than Peter Jennings, Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw back in their day, and now the new guys. He had a larger audience than all of them. And they despised that one guy for 3 hours on radio could inform people of the other side of the news, could inform people of the truth that the news media wasn't giving them. The news media was more interested in a narrative, and here comes Rush Limbaugh and says, well, they're telling it to you this way, but why don't you look at it this way? They left out all these facts. They didn't like the fact that Rush could expose them that. They don't like the fact that you can do that on Facebook. And they demand that you do something else. They demand that Facebook, for the privilege of you being able to do that, pay them. And Facebook said, no, we're not going to pay you for driving traffic to your site that generates you ad revenue by you coming to our site and dropping links or someone else dropping links. Facebook's right. The fact that members of the mainstream media are livid at Facebook says way more about them than Facebook on this issue. Again, Facebook isn't pure as the driven snow. It's got problems. But this is not one of those problems. And the extent that you're about to hear this in the national media, as Facebook's bad, they've done it again, we got to destroy them. It's all about the media not liking that you can use Facebook and disrupt media monopolies.